Atlanta's skyline shimmered in the evening glow, a mix of amber streetlights and neon reflections bouncing off glass towers. Garrett Mackenzie sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his high-rise office, sipping a smooth bourbon. His empire stretched across the city, Soulfire restaurants, the gold standard of fine Southern dining. It wasn't just a business. It was a statement, a declaration that a black man could rise from nothing, build something untouchable, and stand among the giants. Across from him, James Mackenzie, his 19-year-old son, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. College had sharpened his mind, but it hadn't dulled his defiance. He respected his father, but he wasn't afraid to challenge him. "You ever wonder what it's like to be just another black man in your restaurant?" James asked, his voice casual but edged with something sharper. Garrett smirked. "What are you getting at?" James shrugged. "You built Soulfire to be a place where everyone's treated equally. But what if I walked in there, no last name, no connections, just some random black kid off the street? You really think I'd get the same service?" Garrett scoffed. "James, I run a tight ship. My staff is trained. Training doesn't erase bias," James cut in. "It just hides it." Garrett exhaled, shaking his head. "Son, I fought too hard to believe that nonsense. The world respects power, success, and I made sure my restaurants reflect that." James smirked. "Then let me test it." Garrett leaned forward, intrigued. "You serious?" James nodded. "I walk in, I eat, and we see if your perfect system holds up." Garrett chuckled. "Fine, but when you come back and tell me I was right, I expect an apology." James grinned. "We'll see." Friday night, Soulfire downtown. The place was alive, a mix of jazz humming beneath the chatter of well-dressed patrons. Rich mahogany tables, candlelit ambiance, the scent of slow-cooked ribs and smoked brisket lacing the air. It was Garrett's crown jewel, the heart of his empire. James stepped inside, dressed like any other college kid. Hoodie, jeans, sneakers, nothing flashy, just another face in the crowd. He approached the hostess stand. "Table for one," he said. The hostess, Catherine, blonde, early 30s, professional smile, barely glanced at him. "Name?" "James." She nodded, but her eyes flicked past him almost instantly. Two white men in business suits stepped in behind him. She lit up. "Good evening, gentlemen. Right this way." James frowned. He checked his phone. 3 minutes passed. 5, 10. He watched as couple after couple walked in and got seated. He stepped forward again. "Excuse me, I've been waiting." Catherine sighed. "Yeah, we're full right now. You'll have to wait." James glanced at the half-empty dining area. He saw white guests being led to tables that were open when he walked in. "I can take that booth right there," he said, pointing. She barely hid her irritation. "Sir, I said we're full." His jaw clenched. "You just sat 3 tables that came in after me." She gave a thin-lipped smile. "They had reservations." James raised an eyebrow. "You never asked if I had one." A long pause. Then an exaggerated sigh. "Fine. We have space by the bar." James exhaled through his nose. "I don't want the bar. I want a table." Another long pause. Finally, she grabbed a menu and led him to the worst table in the house, right next to the kitchen doors and bathrooms. "There," she said, setting down the menu. "Happy?" James sat watching as she walked off. He checked his phone again. 15 minutes. No water, no server. Across the room, a group of young white professionals laughed as their drinks arrived within minutes. Their server, Brad, mid-30s, white, built like a former linebacker, joked with them as he poured another round. James raised a hand. Nothing. Finally, Brad strolled over, barely masking his disinterest. "You need something?" James stared at him. "Yeah, a menu would be nice." Brad smirked. "Oh, thought you already had one." He grabbed a menu from the next table and tossed it in front of James. James inhaled sharply, keeping his voice level. "I'll have the brisket plate. Collard greens, mac and cheese." Brad scribbled lazily. "Got it." Then he walked away. 30 minutes passed. James watched as a table next to him, who had ordered after him, got their meals. He leaned over. "Excuse me, but I ordered a while ago. Can you check on it?" Brad barely glanced up. "Yeah, I'll get to it." 10 more minutes. James had enough. He stood up and walked to the hostess stand. "Is there a manager I can speak to?" Catherine barely looked up. "What's the issue?" "I've been sitting for 45 minutes. No food, no drink, nothing." Before she could respond, a deep voice cut in. "Problem, sir?" James turned. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a sharp suit stood there. Patrick, the restaurant manager. James squared his shoulders. Yeah, problem is, I seem to be the only person in this place not getting served. Patrick's expression didn't change. Let me check with the kitchen. James folded his arms. I'll wait. Patrick disappeared. 5 minutes later, Brad brought the food, lukewarm. James stared at the plate. This wasn't about the meal anymore. It was about the message. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. Then he pressed record. Meanwhile, across town, Garrett sat in his penthouse office, pouring himself another drink when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He frowned, answering. Mackenzie speaking. A low, distorted voice came through the line. Your son is at your restaurant, and he's about to find out the truth you've been ignoring. Click. Garrett's blood ran cold. What the hell was going on? Garrett Mackenzie sat frozen, the weight of the anonymous call pressing against his chest like a vice. The voice had been distorted, but the message was crystal clear. Something was happening at his restaurant, something he wasn't ready to face. He grabbed his coat, tossed back the last of his whiskey, and stormed out of his office, his mind racing. By the time he pulled up to Soulfire downtown, his pulse was pounding. The sleek, modern restaurant was alive with its usual Friday night crowd, a mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and smooth jazz flowing from the speakers. But as he stepped inside, his trained eye picked up the subtle signs of imbalance. James sat alone at a back table, untouched food in front of him, his phone angled slightly toward the room, recording, documenting. His son's expression was unreadable, but Garrett knew that look. It was the same one he had worn decades ago when he realized the world saw him as less than, no matter how hard he worked. Garrett moved toward him, but before he could reach the table, a loud voice cut through the ambient noise. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stop filming. Brad, the smug-looking white server, loomed over James, arms crossed. His stance was casual, but the energy was off. Too aggressive for a simple request. Garrett's stomach twisted. James leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but firm. Why? Filming's not against the law. Brad huffed a dry laugh. Ain't about the law, it's about respect. We don't allow that kind of thing in here. James didn't blink. You mean holding people accountable? A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Garrett saw heads turning, curiosity peaked, some patrons subtly watching, others pretending not to. The tension in the room thickened. Brad's jaw clenched. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but you... That's enough. Garrett's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. Heads turned. The entire restaurant seemed to pause. Brad stiffened as recognition dawned. Mr. Mackenzie. Garrett ignored him, stepping up to James. You okay? James exhaled, tilting his phone toward his father. The screen showed timestamps, footage, snippets of conversations. I let it play out just like we agreed. And guess what? It's worse than I expected. Garrett took the phone, scrolling through the video. He saw Catherine dismissing James at the front, the passive-aggressive attitude, the preferential treatment of white customers. Then Brad, tossing a menu onto the table like James wasn't worth his time. A deep anger boiled inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He turned to Brad. How long have you worked for me? Brad swallowed hard. 3 years, sir? And in those 3 years, did you ever think I'd tolerate this kind of behavior in my restaurant? Brad opened his mouth, then closed it, shifting on his feet. Garrett turned to Patrick, the manager, who had been lingering near the bar, watching the whole thing. What about you? Patrick hesitated. Sir, I was just about to... Don't lie to me, Garrett snapped. You knew. You let it happen. Patrick exhaled through his nose. With all due respect, Mr. Mackenzie, you haven't exactly been hands-on lately. We run things the way we need to. Garrett's fingers curled into fists at his sides. The way you need to? You mean keeping black customers out of sight? Making them wait longer? Treating them like second-class citizens in a restaurant I built for equality? The murmur in the restaurant grew louder. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with wide-eyed curiosity, knowing they were witnessing something bigger than a simple workplace dispute. Brad scoffed, finally regaining some of his arrogance. Look, sir, I don't make the rules. Some folks just... Don't you dare finish that sentence, Garrett cut him off. His voice was dangerously low now. You think I don't know what you were about to say? That some folks don't tip well, that they cause trouble, that they don't belong here? Brad said nothing, his silence an admission. Garrett took a slow breath, then turned toward the rest of the staff. I want every employee in this building out here, now. A few minutes later, the entire team stood in front of him. Servers, kitchen staff, bartenders, hostesses. Some looked guilty, some looked defensive, others just looked scared. Garrett's voice was steady but cold. I started this restaurant because I wanted to prove that success could be ours, that we could build something, own something, control something. But what I see here tonight, this isn't my vision. This isn't my restaurant. He glanced back at James, then at the expectant crowd watching in silence. If you've ever ignored a black customer, made them wait longer, given them worse service, you no longer work here. If you've ever talked down to them, made them feel unwelcome, you're done. If you think for 1 second that I built this place just to mirror the same discrimination we've fought against our whole lives, you're a damn fool. Silence. Patrick cleared his throat. Sir, with all due respect, Garrett cut him off. Respect? Don't talk to me about respect. You let this happen under your watch. You don't work here anymore. Patrick stiffened. Mr. Mackenzie. You're fired. A shocked gasp spread through the crowd. A few staff members exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had thought they were untouchable. Now they knew better. Garrett turned to Brad. And you? Brad lifted his chin slightly, still trying to hold on to the last shreds of his arrogance. I was just doing my job. Garrett's eyes burned. Then consider yourself unemployed. Another ripple of shock moved through the room. Brad clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no coming back from this. Garrett scanned the remaining staff. If you still work here tomorrow, understand one thing. This place is changing. And if you can't change with it, don't bother showing up. He turned back to James. Come on, we're leaving. James hesitated for a beat, then stood, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He followed his father out the door, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. Outside, the cool Atlanta night air hit them, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation inside. James finally spoke. You really gonna fix it? Garrett let out a slow breath. I built this place for us, and I let it slip through my fingers. But yeah, I'm gonna fix it. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Garrett glanced back at the restaurant, the neon Soulfire sign glowing against the dark sky. He had spent years building his empire, believing he had created something untouchable. Tonight, he had learned the hard way. No empire is safe when the foundation is cracked, and now, it was time to rebuild. Garrett sat in his office, the weight of the night still pressing on his chest. Reports from Soulfire downtown were spread across his desk. Customer complaints, employee records, old HR reports. Patterns started to emerge, things he had ignored for too long. It wasn't just one bad night, it was a system, one that had been running under his nose for years. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. You cleaned house, the distorted voice said. But the problem's bigger than one restaurant. Garrett gripped the phone tighter. Who is this? A pause, then click, his jaw tightened. Someone out there knew more than they were letting on. A knock at the door. James stepped in, tossing a folder onto the desk. Still think this was just a few bad apples? Garrett opened it. Anonymous complaints, past incidents, internal cover-ups. And at the center of it all, one name kept appearing, a high-ranking executive, someone close, someone who had been protecting the system from the inside. Garrett exhaled sharply, the realization settling in. This isn't over, he muttered. James nodded. Not even close. Garrett sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk, staring at the name on the report. David Langston, COO of Soulfire. A man he had trusted for years, a man he had called a friend. Yet here he was, at the center of every buried complaint, every ignored case of discrimination. The pieces started to connect. Langston wasn't just looking the other way. He had built this system. The door creaked open. James leaned against the frame, arms crossed. So? Figured it out. Garrett exhaled through his nose, flipping the folder closed. Langston, James nodded. Knew you'd get there eventually. Garrett shook his head, staring at the papers. How long has this been going on? James walked over, dropping another file onto the desk. Longer than you think. We pulled old HR complaints, customer disputes. Every time something like this happened, it got handled. And guess who had the final say? Garrett opened the file. Emails, internal memos, staff testimonies, managers warning about undesirable clientele. Reports of customers being pushed to worse tables, ignored, overcharged. Every single one signed off by Langston. Garrett clenched his jaw. I built this place for us, and he turned it into something else. James scoffed. You trusted the wrong guy. It happens. Garrett shot him a look. This isn't just wrong guy territory, this is systemic. He didn't just let it happen, he made it happen. James pointed at one of the emails. And he's still doing it. You think last week was an accident? No. It was business as usual. Garrett grabbed his phone, dialing Langston's number. Voicemail. Coward, he muttered, hanging up. He tapped the desk, thinking. We go public with this, he'll just deny it. Say it's a misunderstanding. A few bad employees. We need proof. Something he can't run from. James smirked. Already ahead of you. He pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the desk. Anonymous source. Recordings, emails, transaction records, all of it. Garrett picked it up, weighing it in his hand. Who's your source? James shrugged. Let's just say not everyone at Soulfire was cool with what was happening. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. His son, the kid he thought was too young to understand the real world, had just handed him the smoking gun. Garrett stood, slipping the USB into his pocket. We're gonna make him admit it first. James grinned. Now you're thinking like me.